There is a sound tonight, barely audible above the hum of the city, that I know intimately. The deep, grinding sigh of 1,000-ton hull shifting in deep water. It sounds like a coffin lid scraping against stone, endless and indifferent. That is the sound of the Leviathan, the largest ship ever built by the Horizon Line, the subject of this investigation. We are taught that the ocean is the final frontier, but the truth is that the cruise industry has turned it into a sovereign state of corruption. If you hear a knock, don't answer it. It's too late now anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your current location and the local time down in the comments. Let me know where the dark has found you tonight. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. I booked passage under the name Elias Vance, a recently divorced architect from Seattle, traveling on the Siren's lure. A ship so opulent it felt less like a vessel and more like a floating, gilded cage. The Caribbean sun was too bright, the champagne too bubbly, and the smiles of the crew were too wide, too sharp. I was here to understand the ecology of the void, the specialized darkness that flourishes only on these high seas, far from jurisdiction and accountability. My specific target, this solitary soul retreat, a singles cruise masquerading as a path to recovery, which multiple, suppressed reports suggested was a predatory financial cult. The first 24 hours were a disorientation protocol. Everything was designed to dismantle the passenger's identity and replace it with manufactured community. No one was allowed to sit alone. The retreat facilitators, 3 relentlessly cheerful individuals named Astra, Kale, and Jackson, moved through the crowd like social surgeons, identifying weakness and grafting themselves onto it. I played the part of the grieving, financially stable Mark. My vulnerability was my bait. Astra found me first, leaning over the railing of the promenade deck, gazing into the impossible blue water. She had eyes that held too much understanding and a voice like warm honey laced with sedative. "It's easy to feel lost out here, Elias," she said, her hand resting lightly on my forearm, a gesture of immediate, unearned intimacy. "The sea takes the edges off everything, doesn't it? It leaves you soft." This is the psychological cornerstone of maritime cult formation, a process known as love bombing. It's a scientifically documented phenomenon. When individuals are isolated from familiar support systems and subjected to intense, overwhelming positive attention, their critical thinking decreases rapidly. The vacuum of loneliness is instantly filled, creating a powerful, albeit temporary, bond of dependency. The Siren's lure was 1,000 miles of perfect isolation, a pressurized environment designed to accelerate trust into total submission. The therapy sessions were thinly veiled asset reconnaissance. We weren't talking about grief, we were talking about potential. Kale, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, would lead group discussions focused on shedding earthly baggage. "Where does your security really lie, Elias? In paper assets? Or in shared purpose?" They began weaving the narrative of the anchor, their perpetual, eternal family established on the very foundation of the Horizon Line cruise infrastructure. We were told that conventional life was a temporary illusion, but this life, aboard the perpetually moving city, protected by the sea, was reality. They weren't just passengers, they were permanent residents, drifting forever in blissful, shared isolation. They even had custom-made rings, heavy silver bands embossed with the ship's profile, which they claimed symbolized being permanently tethered to the community, a commitment that, I knew from my research, came only after signing over significant financial resources. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us, waiting for the moment we drop our guard. Here, the watcher was not a ghost, but the collective, predatory warmth of the anchor. They pushed relentlessly. My assigned room, 334, felt less like a stateroom and more like a psychological holding cell. Jackson, the quietest of the three, started leaving notes under my door. Cryptic affirmations mixed with urgent demands for immediate, total honesty about my financial holdings. The sea only accepts full offerings, Elias. Half measures offend the abyss. I spent 3 days pretending to dissolve, letting my guard down enough for them to believe the hooks were set. They isolated me expertly. Every call I tried to make to the outside world was met with satellite interference. Every attempt to engage with regular crew members resulted in a polite, firm interception by Astra or Kale. I was drowning in proximity. The tipping point came on the evening of the Ascension dinner, the mandatory final step before the financial commitment. I feigned a migraine and excused myself early. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I knew the moment they realized I wasn't fully compliant, the love bombing would turn into something far colder. I managed to slip into the ship's empty observation lounge, Deck 11, where an old, poorly secured cleaning closet backed directly onto the executive meeting room. The silence was thick, broken only by the groaning of the hull. That sound again, the scraping stone. I pressed my ear against the thin paneling. Kale's voice was stripped of its velvety warmth, sharp and metallic. He wasn't talking about spiritual ascension. Vance is soft, but he's hesitant. Astra, I told you, stop spending resources on the ones who ask too many questions. We need to hit our quota for the quarter, or the mainland liaison will cut our operating budget. He's worth nearly $4 million in liquid assets, Astra hissed back. He's a gold mine, Kale. We just need to break him tonight. We tell him the shared purpose includes a capital endowment for the permanent residence facility in Belize. That always works. I felt the bottom fall out of my stomach. The permanent residence facility was a fiction, a way to liquidate the assets of the ascended. They were simply predators using the highly structured, yet legally ambiguous, environment of the cruise line to groom and rob vulnerable people. It wasn't supernatural horror, but something far more chilling, meticulously organized human cruelty protected by maritime law. Jackson spoke, his tone casual, chillingly corporate. What about the architect, Vance? If he doesn't sign, does he become a casualty? Astra scoffed. No, Jackson. Not worth the paperwork. If he bolts, we simply alert security that he exhibited psychotic tendencies and was disruptive to the retreat. We blacklist him from the industry, and we move on to the next set of marks waiting in Puerto Rico. We have 3 newly bereaved widows joining the next leg. I backed away, sweat cooling instantly on my neck. The horror wasn't the threat of violence. It was the casual, bureaucratic ease with which they planned to erase my career and discredit my sanity simply for refusing to be robbed. They operated with the confidence of untouchable power, knowing that in the vastness of the ocean, their word held more weight than any distant legal system. I had to get off the ship now. My investigation was blown, but I had the recordings. I didn't wait for morning. I had 5 hours before the Siren's lure docked briefly in Palermo. I moved through the deserted corridors of the lower decks, away from the glittering, predatory life above. I was supposed to be looking for cosmic dread, restless spirits, and ancient curses. What I found was a system perfectly honed to consume the lonely. I passed a laundry cart stacked impossibly high with fresh towels. A heavy padlock secured the contents. This ship, I realized, didn't just carry passengers. It carried secrets, and perhaps far more than just linens. my fear transitioned into a cold, journalistic determination. I escaped the velvet trap, but the ship still held its breath, waiting for me to discover its other, darker mechanics. The stench of brine, stale cooking oil, and industrial disinfectant replaced the scent of expensive perfume and polished mahogany. I had successfully shed astro and kale, but the freedom was relative. I was now operating deep inside the functional architecture of the Siren's lure, where the ship's elegance gave way to structural, relentless utility. I moved through the lower service tunnels, following the ventilation routes that smelled of metallic heat and sweat. I was an anomaly down here, a passenger in civilian clothes among the blur of tired, overworked crew. I was trying to reach a staircase that would take me to the cargo deck, the true underbelly of the vessel, when I heard the low, guttural arguing, muffled by a heavy steel door marked Galley Cold Storage, Restricted Access. Curiosity, that professional affliction, pulled me forward. Peeking around a stack of empty food crates, I saw 3 men, 2 from the kitchen staff, identifiable by their grease-stained white uniforms, and a third, sharply dressed in an expensive suit, holding a secured tablet. The kitchen workers were arguing about a manifest, their voices tight with stress, while the man in the suit watched, detached and clinical. "This batch is too heavy, Marco," the suited man said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. "If customs in Palermo pulls the manifests against the thermal scans, we're all offloaded. Keep the jewelry volume down. We stick to electronics and papers this run." I knew instantly what I was witnessing. It wasn't the petty theft of a towel or a missing wallet. This was a colossal, organized operation. I crept closer, drawn by the sickening scale of the violation. The first freezer unit contained standard frozen produce, but the second, secured by a complex biometric lock, was the true vault. The stench of decay was replaced by the dry, synthetic smell of plastic packaging and high-end leather. The shelves were not stocked with meat or vegetables, but with the spoils of hundreds of voyages, rows of expensive watches, velvet bags containing diamond jewelry, stacks of pristine, stolen passports, and laptops filled with private data. This was the empire of thieves, run by the very people employed to ensure the comfort and security of the passengers. They were utilizing the massive, complex logistics system of the superyacht, the detailed manifests, the scheduled offload times, the dedicated customs routes, to smuggle illicit goods, treating the ship like a moving fortress of crime. As I watched, trying to get a clear shot with the small, hidden camera I carried, I felt a heavy hand clap down on my shoulder. Well, look what the tide dragged in," a deep voice rumbled. It was Jorgensen, the kitchen supervisor, a massive man with forearms like cured ham. His face, normally placid and cheerful when delivering a plated dinner, was hard and calculating now. Fear seized me. This was it. I was exposed. But Jorgensen didn't scream or draw a weapon. He leaned in, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. "You're off the singles trip, Vance? Good. Too much drama. You're better suited for the real business. You found the warehouse early, didn't you? Impressive." He mistook my presence for a planned reconnaissance, assuming I was either a deep cover investigator from a rival organization or a newly recruited asset being tested. The casual nature of his assumption, that anyone moving through the ship's bowels must be involved in something illegal, was horrifying. It implied the corruption was the norm, not the exception. "We run a tight ship, Vance," Jorgensen continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Housekeeping hits the rooms, security clears the footage, we handle the transport, and the guys up top handle the mainland sale. It's clean, efficient, and untraceable. You look like a man who knows how to keep his mouth shut. He offered me a roll, a lookout, an extra pair of hands to move the packaged goods into the logistics chutes just before docking. He mentioned the maintenance worker, a 19-year-old named Leandra, who had recently discovered the operation and had been gently persuaded to sign a non-disclosure agreement while being threatened with being reported as a disruptive employee. The gravity of the situation hit me with visceral clarity. They were so confident, so deeply entrenched, that they didn't fear being discovered by law enforcement. They feared only inefficiency and internal dissent. This is the danger of maritime legal gray areas. Because the ship constantly moves between international waters and sovereign ports, jurisdiction is a nightmare, creating loopholes wide enough to sail the Siren's lure through. The industry's protection of its public image often means internal incidents are suppressed, categorized as accidents, or simply vanish into the static of the open sea. I manufactured an excuse, claiming I needed time to consider the proposal, that I wasn't cut out for physical labor. Jorgensen frowned, his eyes narrowing, but he let me go with a chilling warning. Palermo is in 4 hours. You make your decision before then, Vance. We don't tolerate loose ends on this line. Loose ends have a tendency to become man-overboard incidents. I scrambled back to my temporary room, heart hammering, focusing only on the exit strategy. The ship felt less like a luxury resort and more like a vast, moving prison designed to concentrate and contain every form of organized malice. As I began packing my few belongings, trying to wipe my prints and remove any sign of the surveillance equipment I'd used, a cold sense of wrongness washed over me. It was too quiet. The room was exactly as I had left it, yet subtly different. The curtain over the porthole was drawn just a few millimeters too far. The throw blanket on the chair was folded precisely in the way I never would have done. I paused, looking at my reflection in the dark, non-functioning television screen. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us, waiting for the moment we drop our guard. The horror was shifting again, from corporate theft to something sickeningly personal. I checked the digital lock on my door. It showed green, locked, but I noticed a faint, almost invisible scratch along the magnetic strip, the kind of professional abrasion left by a universal electronic key bypasser. Someone had been in the room, recently, perhaps while I was down in the galley. Then I found the evidence. A tiny, micro-optic lens was embedded almost perfectly into the joint where the wall met the ceiling, directly above my desk. It was connected to what looked like a proprietary speculative concept device, a small, black box powered by an internal battery, transmitting data on a frequency that bypassed the ship's standard Wi-Fi and satellite network. A private, untraceable signal reserved for those who wished to remain truly invisible. This wasn't Jorgensen. The thieves were after goods. This person was after me. I carefully dismantled the setup. Inside the transmitting box, there was a small memory card. I inserted it into my encrypted reader. What unfolded was a gallery of pure, nauseating invasion. Photos of me, smiling awkwardly on the observation deck, before the cult realized I was a fake mark, leaning against the railing, exactly where Astra approached me, asleep in my bed, typing notes on my laptop. Not just simple photos, but detailed analysis. Notes on my posture, my emotional state, my visible financial status, based on my clothing and accessories, and most disturbingly, a detailed psychological profile labeled Elias Vance. Target Profile Alpha 7. The stalker wasn't a passenger. He wasn't crew. He was a professional, an invisible predator specifically targeting vulnerable individuals, travelers, singles, people seeking solitude. documenting their lives, creating detailed dossiers, and selling them to the darkest corners of the dark web for nefarious purposes. The ship was his hunting ground, an ideal environment where security was porous, movement was predictable, and victims were isolated. I recognized the man in the periphery now, haunting the edges of my own photos. The same man I had seen on deck 10, then near the aft elevators, a man with nondescript features and an intense, heavy gaze. I called him the Watchman. He was likely using a secondary, temporary cabin and a fake passenger manifest, just like me, but for infinitely more sinister reasons. The empire of thieves dealt in commodities. The Watchman dealt in human privacy and psychological ruin. I had fallen into a deep, chilling understanding of the Siren's lure. It was a layered ecosystem of exploitation. On the top decks, the cults stripped away financial assets. In the middle, the crews stole physical possessions. And in the silent voids, predators like the Watchman stole souls and data. I had to move. Palermo was near. I couldn't risk either the thieves or the stalker knowing my escape. I gathered my things, leaving behind no evidence of my true identity, and fled my cabin, descending further, seeking the maintenance corridors that led to the engine room. The only part of the ship that always runs honest, brutal, and loud. The horror of the surface had driven me into the physical, decaying heart of the monster. The engine room was an inferno of sound, a relentless, deafening environment that burned the air and shook the very bones of the ship. I moved past the colossal, throbbing diesel generators, the true heart of the Siren's lure, feeling the immense, inhuman power contained within the steel plating. The noise was a welcome shield, a cleansing blast that obliterated the polished lies of the decks above. I looked for a path leading to the medical wing, not the lavish, passenger-facing clinic on deck 5, but the deep storage, crew-only facility far aft. My research had suggested this area held the ship's darkest secret. I was searching for proof of a secret pharmaceutical laboratory, rumored to be using elderly or infirm passengers as unwitting test subjects. The maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth of steaming pipes, electric conduits, and dripping condensation. I found the entry point, a heavy, unmarked hatch disguised behind a bank of emergency life support panels. The air on the other side was sterile and cold, smelling of iodine and fear. This was not a standard infirmary. It was too quiet, too compartmentalized. The layout defied standard architectural practice for passenger ships. I slipped into a small, observation room labeled Staff Break Area, which offered a clear view through a one-way mirror into a clinical laboratory. The sight before me confirmed the darkest speculation. Gleaming centrifuges spun silently. Vials were meticulously labeled with passenger ID numbers. A team of people in full medical scrubs, not the usual ship's doctor, were handling blood and tissue samples with a disturbing intensity. This was the living laboratory at sea. My internal dread solidified into cold fury. These cruises provided pharmaceutical companies with a perfect, contained demographic. Often affluent, compliant elderly passengers, isolated from family, and willing to accept the ship's internal medical authority without question. The ship's distance from shore, combined with the lack of rigorous international oversight, created a legal and ethical vacuum. A clinical psychiatrist, whom I recognized from the ship's promotional material as Dr. Eleanor, was overseeing the operation. She pointed to a clipboard and spoke into a secured intercom, her voice barely audible through the thick glass. Subject 41B is exhibiting accelerated memory degradation. Increased dosage of compound gamma 9. We need to measure the tolerance threshold before the next scheduled port call. Remember, no paper trail, no consent forms. Just data collection. I focused on the equipment, specifically the blood profiling machines, trying to determine the scope of the testing. I needed physical evidence. As I moved to leave the observation area, my attention was snagged by a small, secured wing labeled long-term care suites. Something about the heavy steel doors and the complete lack of external signage suggested a profound secret. I used a modified electromagnetic key I carried to bypass the lock on the nearest door, slipping inside. The room was dimly lit, silent, and unervingly Victorian, like the passenger rooms I had seen in my research about another ghost story on this line. Though this room was on Deck 3, far from any Deck 7 anomaly. In the center of the spacious suite sat two occupants, an elderly man and woman, Russell and Dorothy, sitting side by side on a heavy velvet sofa. They were dressed in expensive, tailored clothes, looking pristine but utterly vacant. They were holding hands, their fingers interlaced in a grip that looked less like affection and more like structural necessity. I recognized the couple. They had been celebrating their 40th anniversary on this very cruise. A few days ago, they had been vibrant, if slightly frail. Now they were shells. Their eyes were open, fixed on a distant point, and when I leaned closer, I saw a subtle, chilling synchronicity in their breathing, their minuscule head movements. Russell whispered, a breathy, dry sound, "The blue dress. Paris, 1983. Dorothy immediately completed the thought, her voice equally thin and distant. The wine was terrible, but we didn't care. The rain stopped just for us. It wasn't a memory they were sharing. It was one consciousness expressing itself through two separate, deteriorating bodies. This was the horror of the strange fusion. My background reading flashed through my mind. This was the ultimate, speculative concept of the Horizon Line's unethical experimentation. They weren't just testing drugs. They were experimenting with human identity, pushing long-married couples beyond symbiosis into literal neurological overlap. By chemically inducing simultaneous symptoms, shared pain, nausea, disorientation, they were forcing the brain's synchronization, ultimately dissolving the boundaries of self. This wasn't an accident. I saw a thin four-line trailing from Russell's arm into a small, portable pump hidden beneath the sofa. I quickly scanned the pump's output display. The substance being administered was labeled synaptic unifier, a compound designed not to cure, but to merge. I was witnessing the medical creation of an empty shell, two bodies housing a single, fractured entity. The ship's medical team was turning people into living sculptures, perfect for studying the dissolution of ego, or perhaps simply discarding them once the merger was complete. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us, and I imagined Dr. Eleanor's clinical, cold assessment of human consciousness being an arbitrary, disposable commodity. I felt a sudden, visceral need to destroy the evidence and escape. I yanked the four-line free, causing a small, dark spurt of blood. Russell and Dorothy remained motionless, their synchronized breathing undisturbed. They were already gone, existing only in that shared, internal landscape. I backed out of the suite, sealing the door again. The sight of the couple, their shared, hollow gaze, was a deeper form of psychological trauma than the cult or the thieves. Those were external threats. This was a violation of the very structure of the self. I had to move. The medical team would notice the breached suite soon. I scrambled further down the maintenance tunnels, away from the sterile chill of the lab, chasing the promise of the escape waiting in Palermo. I reached a junction. The passage split between the engine room, too hot, too loud, too exposed to Jorgensen, and a narrow, vertical service shaft meant for cable routing. I chose the shaft, reasoning that no one would patrol such a cramped, impractical space. I began the arduous climb up, ascending away from the deepest layers of the ship's rot. It was in this ascent, pressing my back against the rough, riveted steel, that I noticed the architectural anomaly. The service shaft passed through the layers of the ship's decks, 3, 4, 5, 6. The numbering was etched in faded stencil on the steel beams. But between deck 6 and deck 8, the shaft passed through a space that should not have existed. It was a blank, unnumbered corridor about 20 feet high, a distinct, empty space between the ship's official architecture. It was structurally impossible. The deck plans I had studied online were detailed, showing the ship's rigid design. But here, the ship seemed to possess a hidden floor, an interstitial space unaccounted for. I reached the hatch leading out onto Deck 7, the first official deck above the medical horror. As I slid the heavy cover aside and stepped out, I realized I was entirely alone. The usual polished crowds were gone, replaced by an unsettling, deep silence. The carpet was a shade darker, the wood paneling older, smelling faintly of dust and something dry, like ancient potpourri. And there it was, at the far end of the long, empty corridor, bathed in the strangely amber glow of non-standard lighting. A door, tucked between two fire exits, bearing a brass plate engraved with 3 perfect, silent numbers. 777. It didn't exist. I checked the small section map on the wall. The corridor ended at room 775, followed by a laundry room. Yet, 777 stood before me, solid, heavy, and undeniably real, mocking the architecture, defying the map, a door to a place that had been written out of reality. The silence here was different from the silence in the lab. It was the profound, acoustic silence of the sea floor, where sound simply ceases to travel. I felt a cold dread replacing the journalistic adrenaline. I had crossed from the horror of human corruption into the pure, unsettling territory of the supernatural. The ship was not just a container for crime. It was a conduit for something truly outside of our reality. I knew I was standing on the threshold of the story I had heard whispered, the vanishing room, the spectral residence, the final piece of the structural anomaly, the key to the ship's hidden truth. I felt compelled to open the door, knowing that whatever was inside held the deepest, most permanent secrets of the Siren's lore. The brass handle of room 777 was cool beneath my palm, weighty and impossibly old. It felt like turning the key in a forgotten clockwork mechanism, winding up something that should have ceased ticking decades ago. The air around the door was still, but I could feel a subtle pressure against my eardrums, a shift in the environment that suggested I was passing from one dimension into another. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was vast, an open space that geometrically defied the ship's hull dimensions. It was an anachronism, a perfectly preserved Victorian smoking lounge. The walls were lined with dark, rich walnut paneling, lit by gaslight fixtures that cast a perpetual amber dusk. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic clinking of porcelain and the soft hiss of non-existent steam heat. It smelled of old leather, stale tea, and the subtle, lingering scent of ozone, like a storm that had passed long, long ago. 3 figures sat around a small, antique mahogany table, engaged in a perpetual, silent afternoon tea. They looked up as I entered, and their composure was the most unsettling thing of all. There was no surprise, no alarm, only a faint, polite recognition, as if I were merely a late arrival to an eternally scheduled function. The 3 occupants were dressed in styles decades apart. A woman, elegant in a sweeping gown from the late 1980s, named Malia. A man with a thin mustache and the crisp uniform of a 1990s cruise ship officer, named Solomon. And another, younger man, dressed in faded, contemporary 2000s resort wear, named Chance. "Welcome back, Mr. Vance," Malia said, her voice dry and delicate, like pressed flower petals. She did not ask if I was okay or if I needed help. She simply indicated the fourth, empty chair. "The tea is still warm." I did not sit. My heart hammered, but my voice remained steady, schooled by years of investigating the edges of reality. "I am not a resident. I'm investigating the ship. This room shouldn't exist." Solomon laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to absorb the light. "That's what they all say, isn't it? Existence is terribly overrated, my friend. It's noisy, drafty, full of schedules and petty worries." This room, I realized, was the perfect speculative concept, a pocket dimension, a fold in the ship's temporal structure, designed to ensnare and suspend. It was the ultimate trap for lonely souls, not the cult's financial trap, but a metaphysical one, offering eternal rest and perfect isolation. I tried to ground myself with a grounding fact. I thought of the physics of structural stress. Cruise ships are marvels of modern engineering, meticulously planned to displace colossal amounts of water while maintaining stability. For a space like this to exist, an expansion into another spatial dimension would require an immense, continuous energy anomaly, a sustained tear in the fabric of space-time fueled by something the ship constantly produced. Loneliness, despair, fear. "I know who you are," I stated, forcing the conversation forward, watching their expressions for any crack in the facade. "Malia, you vanished from the Poseidon line in 1988, reported as slipped on deck. Solomon, 1994, unidentified health incident. Chance, 2007, failed railing inspection. All of you disappeared from this very line, within these waters." Their smiles widened, thin and unsettling. They didn't deny it. "We merely retired," Chance chirped, picking up a silver teaspoon. "The schedules became tiresome. The land, tedious. Here, the world is stable. Nothing changes. The tea is always just right." The chilling realization was that they weren't exactly ghosts. They were something far more complex. Living remnants, perfectly preserved by the localized temporal distortion, choosing oblivion over the complexity of life. They were eternal residents, their lives paused at the moment of peak exhaustion or isolation, preserved like insects in amber. I needed to know how they entered, how the room selected its victims, and what fueled its perpetual existence. "How does the room find you?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly off the walnut paneling. Malia poured a fresh cup of tea, the liquid steaming faintly. "It doesn't find us, Elias. We find it. Don't you feel it? The exhaustion? The desire for absolute stillness? When you are truly, deeply tired of the turning world, when you have nowhere else to go, the ship provides the path. It whispers the sequence. It adjusts the maps. It gives you the three perfect numbers." I thought of the cult members, Astra, Kale, and Jackson, preying on the lonely. I thought of the stolen jewelry, the medical experiments, the data stalker. The Siren's lure was a machine that generated despair and consumed it. Room 777 was the ultimate processing unit. "You're trapped," I countered. "You chose to become structural anomalies. You left behind lives, families, futures." Solomon took a slow sip of his tea. "Future? That's what they sell on the main deck, Mr. Vance. It's a cruel deception. We have eternity, and we have tranquility. No bills, no paperwork, No need to pretend we care about the next port of call. This was the chilling emotional core of the room, the ultimate escape from accountability and stress, purchased with the price of one's entire existence. They were the willing missing persons, erased from the ship's official logs, their absence recorded as a mundane accident, while they remained here, drinking tea forever. I felt a profound, cold pity for them. They had chosen the ultimate solitude, a final, perfect isolation that insulated them from the crimes happening only a few decks away. They were safe from the watchman, safe from Jorgensen, safe from Dr. Eleanor. But they were also completely inert, merely decorative elements in the ship's deepest secret. As I stood there, watching the dust motes swirl in the amber gaslight, I had a terrifying, reflective thought. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. But here, there was only the quiet terror of what we become when we stop watching ourselves. A sudden, jarring sound from outside the room shattered the temporal peace. A ship's horn, not the smooth, scheduled blast, but a long, frantic wail, signaling distress. Malia flinched, the sound briefly penetrating her shield of indifference. "That's new," Chance murmured, his voice laced with the faintest flicker of concern. "The static usually keeps the now out." The air pressure immediately changed. The amber light flickered, and the scent of ozone intensified, overlaid now by the sharp, metallic tang of cold sea spray. The engine's low thrum, previously dampened to nothing, returned with a violent, uneven shudder. The ship was hitting heavy seas. "Something has changed on the bridge," Solomon said, looking troubled. "The captain is breaking protocol." The reality of the open ocean had breached the supernatural shelter of room 777. The trap was still there, but the storm was overwhelming the ship's ability to maintain the fold in space. I turned quickly toward the door. "I'm leaving. I have to see what's happening." "Do be careful, Elias," Malia advised, her tone shifting from polite invitation to genuine, if detached, concern. "Once you leave the 3 perfect numbers, they rarely let you back in. The void outside is getting hungry." I slipped out, closing the heavy brass door behind me. The hallway was no longer quiet. The carpet was sodden in places, and the lights were blinking erratically. Deck 7 was shuddering violently, and the air was charged with a palpable sense of anxiety. I could hear crew members shouting above the roar of the ship's engines, now struggling to maintain speed. I scrambled up the nearest internal staircase, ascending to the highest passenger deck, Deck 12, where the observation lounge offered the best view of the ocean. My planned escape in Palermo was now irrelevant. The ship was gripped by an external, meteorological horror, a terror of the deep that eclipsed the manufactured cruelties below deck. When I reached the observation deck, the scene outside the massive panoramic windows was apocalyptic. The sea was not blue or green. It was a churning, chaotic slate, and the sky was dark, pressed down by an impossible weather event. And there it was, the source of the dread, a circular, impossibly symmetrical storm cloud, sitting stationary against the horizon like a charcoal lid placed upon the sea. It was too perfect, too localized, defying all known meteorology. It was a hole in the sky, and the Siren's lure was sailing directly toward its edge. The air on Deck 12 was electric, crackling with static energy and a humidity that felt heavy, almost suffocating. The polished veneer of the observation lounge had shattered. Passengers were huddled, pale and silent, watching the storm cloud approach. It was a visual assault, a massive, perfectly circular cyclonic entity, jet black at its center, with edges so sharply defined they looked drawn with a compass. This was not a natural occurrence. This was the fear storm, the metaphysical anomaly that stalked the horizon line. The ship's captain, Elias Vance, no relation to my temporary alias, thankfully, was on the bridge, his voice booming over the internal address system, strained and frantic. "Attention passengers and crew. This is the captain. We are encountering an unexpected, severe weather system. All personnel must secure their stations. Passengers, please return to your cabins immediately. This is not a drill." His reassurance was undermined by his tone, raw panic barely contained by professional discipline. I pressed myself against the window, mesmerized by the cloud's unnatural perfection. It was an ocular vortex, and the deeper I stared, the more the silence around the cloud felt like a tangible presence. I thought of the grounding fact of atmospheric science. Circular storms, while rare, are scientifically explained by concentrated heat differences. This cloud, however, was clearly feeding on something else. It was an elemental entity, a speculative concept designed to consume the ship's primary fuel source, pure, concentrated fear. The anxiety of the passengers below, the victims of the cult, the stalker, and the medical lab, was feeding the storm, making it stronger. As the ship drew closer, the radio frequency in the lounge, usually playing soothing, classical music, cut out entirely, replaced by a wash of white noise. But within the static, there were fleeting, bone-chilling transmissions. Mayday requesting immediate extraction. Hull breach on deck 2. No one answers. We have lost power. Where are we? The fog is too thick. This is the ode to joy. These were distress signals from ships that had vanished decades ago. Ships that had been consumed by the sea and the static of maritime history. The storm wasn't just physical. It was a temporal anomaly, echoing the final moments of its previous meals. The ode to joy was the nickname of a supply vessel that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle in 1971. I looked at the passengers. Their terror was visible, raw, and uncontrolled. One woman was hyperventilating, another rocking back and forth. The fear was a tangible miasma, rushing from the decks below into the air, straight towards the consuming cloud. And then I saw the captain, Vance, burst out of the bridge wing and onto the exterior walkway, unprotected against the sudden, violent rain that began to lash the deck. He was a small, intense man, a former naval meteorologist. Now, his professionalism was completely undone. "It knows," he screamed into the wind, his voice barely heard over the groan of the ship. "It's been following us for 3 days. Always the same distance, perfectly round. It's waiting for the fear to peak." His executive officer scrambled after him, trying to pull him back to the safety of the bridge. "Captain, the readings are impossible. We need to divert. It's absorbing the radar signals." Vance wrestled free, pointing a shaking finger directly at the black heart of the cloud. "Diverting won't work. We tried that. It changes course with us. It's a reflection, damn it. It's our own dread given form." I felt a wave of crushing nausea, a profound empathy for the captain's complete psychological breakdown. He was a man of science facing something fundamentally unscientific, something that mocked the very instruments he relied on. I recalled the core mystery of the fear storm. It intensifies as the internal fear of the passengers grows. The captain's initial attempts to escape by diverting had only prolonged the agony, allowing the internal fear, fueled by the cult, the thieves, and the medical lab's atrocities, to build into a critical mass. The logical, impossible solution dawned on me. He wasn't meant to divert away from the storm. He had to steer into its eye. The eye of a hurricane is a place of profound calm, a center of low pressure surrounded by maximum violence. If this storm was a metaphysical entity fueled by fear, then sailing into its core might be the only way to disrupt its energy source. The eye would be the point of minimum fear, the point of total saturation. Just as the thought crystallized, Captain Vance made his terrifying decision. He broke away from his officer and bolted back into the bridge. The ship gave a violent lurch, sending passengers scrambling across the slick floor. The roar of the engines changed pitch, straining to maintain maximum velocity. "Brace for impact," the captain's voice roared over the intercom, devoid of all composure now. "We are steering straight into the center. If we don't pass through it, it will never let us go." The Siren's lure, a symbol of human luxury and control, became a terrified bullet aimed at the heart of the void. The next minute was pure, visceral chaos. The ship hit the outer wall of the cloud, the most intense part of the storm. The noise was unbearable, a tearing, grinding sound as if the steel hull were being shredded by invisible teeth. Windows on the lower decks blew out. I clung to a structural pillar as the ship rolled 45 degrees, the sea becoming vertical outside the observation window. The static intensified, now a screaming chorus of lost souls, warning us, inviting us. Then, just as the noise and the shaking reached a terrifying peak, plunging us into total, chaotic darkness, we hit the eye. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. Silence. The only sound was the deep, relieved sigh of the engines. Outside the windows, the world was an impossible cylinder of black cloud. But where we were, the air was still, clear, and perfectly, eerily bright, illuminated by a high, cold moon that should have been invisible. We were floating in a perfect bubble of tranquility, surrounded by roaring apocalypse. I looked down at the pale, shaking faces of the passengers. The fear had not vanished, but it had peaked and begun to recede, replaced by a stunned, disoriented awe. The storm, denied its fuel, was weakening. We were in the eye for only 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity suspended between life and death. I felt a draining pressure in my chest, a profound exhaustion, as if the ship, too, was exhaling the collective terror it had carried. As we punched out the other side of the cloud, the sun immediately reappeared, dazzling and clean, reflecting off a calm, sapphire sea. The cloud was behind us, already dissipating into normal stratus, leaving only a lingering chill in the air and a permanent tremor in the ship's structure. The immediate crisis was over, but the damage was done. The captain was a broken man. I saw him being escorted off the bridge by medics, his eyes wide and unseeing, whispering, "It wasn't science. It wasn't science." Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. And now, the storm had seen all of us and exposed the deep, structural flaws of the Siren's lure. I knew my window for escape was narrow. With the ship damaged and the crew distracted, I had to reach the disembarkation point in Palermo, which was now less than 2 hours away, even with the speed reduced. I had survived the cosmic dread, but I still had to escape the very human, organized malice of the ship's staff, who would surely be looking for the disruptive passenger, Elias Vance. I moved quickly, my adrenaline fueled now by a cold, calculating resolve. The surface was calm, but the ship's structural integrity, both physical and ethical, had been irrevocably compromised. The chaos from the storm was my greatest asset. The main decks were a torrent of activity, frantic crew members assessing structural damage, medics attending to injured passengers, and the atmosphere thick with the smell of ozone and spilled chlorine from the swimming pools. The organized crime ring, the cult, and the stalker were, for the moment, secondary to the immediate survival of the vessel. I made my way down to Deck 2, the designated disembarkation level, using the emergency stairwells. The ship had suffered serious internal damage, and I could hear the rhythmic clunk-clunk of water pumps desperately trying to counter the hull stress caused by the meteorological ordeal. I didn't try to blend in with the remaining passengers. I knew that my temporary identity, Elias Vance, had been flagged by multiple factions. Instead, I slipped into the crew service tunnels again, carrying my encrypted data on a tiny, secure drive concealed within a hollowed-out piece of cheap plastic. I passed the medical center. The doors to the long-term care suites were open, the rooms now empty. Dr. Eleanor and her team had evacuated the evidence, moving the fused couple and the experimental compounds off the books entirely. The ship had a remarkable capacity for immediate, systemic self-cleansing. As I neared the exit ramps, disguised partially by a stolen maintenance jacket, I encountered Jorgensen, the kitchen supervisor and thief. He was coordinating the movement of massive, sealed logistics crates onto the offload ramp. He was sweating profusely, his face grim, focused only on preserving his empire. He spotted me immediately. His eyes narrowed, recognizing me despite the dirty jacket. The false warmth was gone, replaced by pure, cold threat. "Vance," he spat, moving towards me, blocking my path to the gangway. "You should have taken the deal. We heard you caused trouble for Astra's people. We don't like witnesses, especially the ones who get to walk away after the storm." He reached into his jacket. I didn't wait to see the weapon. I used the environment, a basic survival strategy. I shoved a nearby stack of empty aluminum beverage kegs, sending them clattering into his legs. Jorgensen roared, stumbling back, momentarily stunned. I darted past him and sprinted toward the gangway, which was already extended toward the dock. I knew I had mere seconds before security would be alerted. This moment defined the true terror of the crew's line, the realization of the unsinkable lie. On the high seas, no law could truly protect me. The complex web of maritime jurisdiction, coupled with the massive financial power of the Horizon Line, meant that even if I survived and reported the cult, the thieves, the medical experiments, and the stalker, the system itself would protect them. They would bury my testimony under paperwork, label me a disgruntled passenger, and suppress the evidence of their systemic corruption. I hit the ramp, racing down the final stretch to the stone dock of Palermo. But just as my foot reached solid ground, I heard the ship's internal security alarm sound, a high, piercing wail, specifically targeting my position. I didn't stop to look back. I vanished into the bustle of the Palermo shipyard, losing myself among the dock workers and incoming freight. I survived. I escaped with the data, recordings of the cult's planning, photos of the stolen goods, details of the fusion experiment, and most chillingly, the architectural evidence of Deck 7 and Room 777, the supernatural anomaly. But as I sat later that evening in a cold, anonymous hotel room, reviewing the surveillance footage I had taken in my own cabin, the evidence of the watchman, the professional stalker, I noticed something crucial in the background of one photo, a detail I had missed. The micro-optic lens was not the only piece of equipment in the room. Tucked discreetly into the desk lamp, aimed at the door, was a tiny, professional security camera, the kind used by the ship's own security detail. The watchman, the data stalker, wasn't an independent predator. He was condoned by the ship's security. They were using his services, his extensive database of vulnerable passengers, perhaps even selling him the access codes to the rooms, creating a synergistic nightmare of organized crime and privacy violation. The system was designed not to protect, but to facilitate the victimization of the passengers. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the terrifying symmetry of the horror. The cult, Astra, Kale, Jackson, exploited the lonely for finance. The thieves, Jorgensen, Marco, exploited the luxurious for possessions. The medical team, Dr. Eleanor, exploited the vulnerable for science. The watchmen exploited the isolated for data. And Room 777 exploited the exhausted for eternal, structural removal from reality. All of it operating under the smiling, corporate guise of the Horizon Line cruise ship. A perfectly engineered environment where isolation, wealth, and legal ambiguity created the ideal incubator for every imaginable form of systemic horror. I was safe now, in Italy, but the experience had fundamentally altered me. I spent the next few months living in deep seclusion, publishing my findings anonymously through encrypted channels, knowing that any direct attempt to expose the Horizon Line would result in my character being destroyed, my findings discredited, and my own past used against me by the powerful entities I had just exposed. The captain lost his career, unable to reconcile his belief in meteorology with the entity that ate fear. The survivors of the fear storm were deeply scarred, haunted by the echoing voices of the lost ships. The victims of the cult and the lab vanished into the system's silence. And sometimes, when I close my eyes in the dark, I don't hear the gentle sound of the morning traffic outside. I hear the low, deep groan of the ship's hull shifting in the black water, the sound of the unseen door on Deck 7 opening just slightly, inviting me back to the eternal stillness of the three perfect numbers. I know I will never step onto a ship again. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't the ocean. It's the smiling institution that promises paradise and delivers oblivion. The recording stops now. The clock on the wall ticks loud and slow, a dry, dusty sound that reminds me I am anchored, stationary, safe in a room that is exactly where it is supposed to be. Outside, the first suggestion of morning is bleeding through the curtain seams, a cold, indifferent gray that promises daylight, but not necessarily relief. The nightmares still come, of course, vivid, structural dreams where the halls of the Siren's lure stretch endlessly, and the laughter of the cult members mixes with the deep, resonating groan of the ship's massive hull, shifting under duress. I look at the map of Deck 7, the digital rendering still saved on my screen. I have meticulously cross-referenced every blueprint, every official document, and still, Room 777 is an impossibility.